Well, thank you guys for being here. Here's what I want to talk to you about. There's some issues in neuroscience that reflect on what we know about music. So in neuroscience laboratories, we study the brain at many different levels. So you can have a whole laboratory that studies molecules and others that study whole neurons or networks of neurons and systems in the brain. And what my interest has always been is in understanding how all of the wet biological pieces and parts come together for your perception of the world. So that's what I want to share with you a little bit today. So there's an old philosophical problem that everybody has thought at some point about how do we actually know that what I call blue is what you call blue? How do we know that in our heads it matches? Because it might be completely different in your head and mine. And it doesn't matter. As long as our mothers have taught us to both call that blue, then we can transact and negotiate in the outside world. And our experiences might be very different on the inside. And it turns out that the story is actually a lot worse than that, because what I call reality and you call reality might be completely different. And my whole world might be upside down from yours, and it wouldn't matter as long as we can transact and negotiate on the outside. So this used to be a philosophical question, and in recent decades it's been elevated to the level of a scientific problem. And one of the ways I study this is with something called synesthesia, which most of you have probably heard of. As far as the word goes, everyone's heard of anesthesia. Synesthesia is joined feeling instead of no feeling, and it's a blending of the senses. So synesthesia looks something like this. Here's an experience of synesthesia. The key is that it's automatic and involuntary. It's unconscious. It's an experience where normal stimulation to one sense ends up triggering an experience in another sense. And the thing is that people with synesthesia are not being artistic or metaphorical or poetic. It's that they're actually having a cross-modal experience because of a blending of parts in their brain. So that's all the animal research I'm going to show. And the rest is about humans, which is, this is the most common form of synesthesia here. It's where things like letters and numbers and weekdays and months will trigger a color experience. And so for this synesthete, it's just self-evidently true to her that G is red, and Wednesday is purple, and May is powder blue. This is not her being poetic or on drugs or something. It's actually that she's having that experience when she sees or even thinks about one of those elements that triggers something. And it used to be thought that synesthesia was very rare, something like 1 in 20,000 people. We now know that it's very common. It's probably up to 4% of the population has synesthesia. And so that means that certainly several people in this room have this form of synesthesia. Now, it turns out there are many forms of synesthesia. Anything you can imagine where some sense is communicating across the others, we found examples of. So here's just an example. This is a woman who happens to be an artist, and when she hears sounds, it triggers a visual experience. So this happens to be her visual experience when the furnace kicks on and goes whoosh. That's what she sees physically. There's tasting of shapes. Some people, when they put a taste in their mouth, they get an experience of something on their fingertips. So this particular gentleman cooks by tasting the food and seeing whether it feels pointy or smooth, or that's how he knows when the chicken is ready. This is a very common form, which we call spatial sequence synesthesia, and this is where people will perceive things like weekdays or months or numbers or years as having particular spatial locations. And in fact, I see one person nodding. There are several people in the room who will have this form of synesthesia. It's extremely common. And the fact is that most synesthetes will live and die. They'll go their whole lives without knowing that other people don't see the world the way they do, right? Because we all accept the reality that's presented to us. And it's only when you read an article on synesthesia or come to the Music and Mind Conference and hear a talk on synesthesia, things like that, that people realize that maybe other people aren't seeing things the way they are. Now, there are a lot of ways in which people have synesthetic experiences with music. This is one subject that I've studied extensively, and she is a musician and has a very rich synesthesia. So, for example, all of her pitches have a very particular color experience for her. And again, it's not that she's just sort of making up an association and memorizing it. It's that she actually experiences the color when she hears these different notes. And you can see that some of these colors can be very specific. So C for her is a goldish white, like sunlight. D is silvery white. E is fiery orange. She has a slight difference with F, whether she's seeing it on the page or hearing it. And so on. So for pitches of this scale, she has very particular colors. There was a paper in the journal Nature recently about someone who, hearing different chords, different intervals on the piano, that puts a taste in his mouth physically. And I'll tell you in a minute how we verify these sorts of things, that people aren't just being poetic about it, that we can actually verify these things. But anyway, it was tested, and it's found that for different tone intervals, that triggers this feeling of taste in the mouth. This is back to LS, this synesthetic subject that I study. She has all kinds of musical synesthesia. But one thing I thought was interesting is that based on the type of harmony that's going on, she actually feels like her body's moving in different ways. So tonic scale, she feels like she's standing upright. Others, she feels like she's flying low above the ground or stepping on a stair or soaring and so on. And again, she actually, every time she hears these different functional harmonies, she feels that kinesthetic sense. Okay, so there are lots and lots of forms of synesthesia. This is a list compiled by one of my colleagues. And the percentages have something to do roughly with the prevalence in the population, but those numbers have been updated, so don't worry about that. In the population of synesthetes, I mean. But what I want to illustrate by this list is just the variation, the number of ways that you can have cross-modal connections. Essentially, anything you might imagine, we found cases of that and studied. Now, what causes synesthesia has to do with slightly increased crosstalk between brain areas. So different parts of the brain, different neural populations are involved in processing different kinds of information. So there are some parts of your brain, for example, involved in processing letters and numbers, and other parts of your brain involved in color. And what happens in synesthesia is that these have slightly more crosstalk going on between them. Now, there's debate about whether that's caused by increased wiring, physical, neurons connecting these areas, or instead whether it's caused by chemical imbalance. In other words, slightly more excitation than inhibition, such that the activity in one area actually kindles activity in the other area. But the idea is, with a synesthete, with this increased crosstalk, if they see a letter or a number, that triggers the color area, and then they have the experience of synesthesia. And so with whatever we're talking about, let's say musical synesthesia, where notes trigger it, you can imagine, the areas that are involved in musical notes are triggering these color areas. So that's what causes synesthesia. Synesthesia is not disadvantageous. In fact, it's probably only advantageous. And one of my graduate students is always asserting that synesthetes are going to take over the world. And the reason it's advantageous is because synesthetes tend to have a better memory. So if you're synesthetic and I tell you my phone number, you might forget it, but you'll remember, oh yeah, it had a nice autumn pattern to it. And that allows you to reconstruct it. And so when it comes to memorizing things like, there's a guy who can memorize pi, 3.1415, out to 20,000 digits. Well, that would be completely impossible for most of us, but he has a very rich synesthesia where every digit has a color, a size, a texture, a gender, and a personality. And as a result, there's a whole story landscape going on there when he's memorizing pi. So that's a sense in which synesthesia is advantageous. And one thing that my colleagues and I are looking into is whether perfect pitch, absolute pitch, is a form of synesthesia. Because it may be that in the same way somebody hears the letter J and has a purple experience, that somebody might hear a B flat and have a particular experience of color, or even just a somatic feeling that goes along with that, and by that feeling judge whether the pitch is on or not. And there's a friend of mine who is a professional drum tuner. He flies around all the rock and roll bands and tunes their drums, and he has synesthesia, and he can tell whether the sound is sharp or flat by the color that it's giving. So if the blue is not quite right, he tunes the drum until it's exactly the right color. So it is only advantageous. The only time I ever heard of being disadvantaged is this guy right here, who his letters are colored, and so he memorizes people's names. He remembers their name by the colors, but it's disadvantage to him because it just happens that Dave and Rob have the same colors as Mike and Dan, so he always messes those names up. But otherwise, it's only advantageous. And of course, many artists have leveraged their synesthesia into their greatest works. So Kandinsky, for example, would crank up the phonograph and stand in front of his canvas, and he would paint what he was seeing, given the music. David Hockney has synesthesia, and he's interviewed in a book I wrote on synesthesia. Nabokov, one of my favorite authors, he had synesthesia for letters and numbers. He started off with the Cyrillic alphabet because he was Russian, and then when he moved to America and learned the rest of our Roman alphabet, his synesthesia transferred over to the new letters there, and he wrote a lot about that. There were many musicians with synesthesia. Here are just a few. Amy Beach. Here's what it says in her biography about her. C was white, F sharp was black, E yellow, G red, and so on. Until the end of her life, she associated these colors with those keys. And so, what we can do is sort of a retrospective historical diagnosis with these things. Some conditions about the brain are harder to diagnose than others. Synesthesia is particularly easy to spot. And we see this all the time with musicians' descriptions. Olivier Messiaen, he describes his mission to paint the visible world with sound. He picks particular sound combinations that will yield particular colors for him. Now, it turns out, of course, that with synesthesia, it's completely idiosyncratic. So what one synesthete is experiencing in relation to a particular pitch or chord is completely different than what another synesthete is experiencing. So it's sort of a fool's mission to paint the world this way with colors, because it will sound, another synesthete will have a very different experience than Messiaen will. Nonetheless, this is how he composes his music. There's a really long list of musicians with synesthesia. I just put a few of them here. It's very common in the musical community. It's been suggested that there might be an overrepresentation of synesthetes in music or in the arts in general. We don't know for certain this is true, because everybody can point at all sorts of famous musical synesthetes, but nobody's really tested the community of deep sea divers or accountants or anything for synesthesia, so we don't actually know if it's overrepresented among artists, but nonetheless, it's a suspicion that we all have. I'll just mention Scriabin because some people are familiar with his work, and he was very interested in the psychological effects of sound and color together, and he tried all sorts of things with this combination. It turns out that as people have looked at this carefully, it's probably the case that he was not actually synesthetic from a neurological point of view, but nonetheless, he was exploring it from an artistic point of view, which is fine, but it's not under my element of study because I'm interested in the neurosynesthesia. Okay, just a quick moment to tell you how we actually tell if somebody's synesthetic, because you might be wondering, how do you know if they're just making it up? My lab developed synesthete.org. It's the Synesthesia Battery. This is freely available to the public. If you think you might have synesthesia, go and test yourself on it. This is a battery of tests that is open, and this has become the gold standard in the field of synesthesia. Here's one way that we test. So, for example, let's say you have colored letters. You come to this test, we present you with the letter, and with this color slider here and this one here, you can choose any one of 16 million different colors. And so we say, look, given this letter, choose the color that best matches your synesthetic percept. So you go through and you find exactly the right color, and you press submit, and then you get the next letter or digit, and the next and the next. And in total, you're shown each letter or number 3 times each in random order. So what I'm doing here is plotting for this synesthete the colors that she chose, and you can see that there's a lot of consistency. In contrast, if I ask non-synesthetes to fake it and pretend they're synesthetes, it's really quite a difficult test to pass. And what you see in the control here, the length of the bars represents the variance in color space. So in other words, how wobbly they were in their color choices. And it turns out, we ask them to use free association and memory, and it's really hard to remember exactly the color that you answered for J 57 trials ago out of 16 million colors. So this is one way that we can distinguish real synesthetes from malingerers. We've translated this to all kinds of different languages, and we can test many forms of synesthesia. The ones of interest here today that I'll be talking about are the ones involving music. So we can test all sorts of things, and as a result, when I started off in the field, most of the papers on synesthesia had between sort of 1 to 8 subjects. And at this point, because of having this automated way of testing, we have over 12,000 rigorously verified synesthetic subjects, and that's really changed the field in terms of what we can do in behavior and genetics and neuroscience. So I'll just mention one of the things in my lab that we're doing is looking inside synesthetes' brains using non-invasive neuroimaging. And we're also pulling the genes for synesthesia. It turns out it's heritable. It runs in families. And I won't tell you any of the details of this except to say that we found a hotspot on chromosome 16 and we're moving in on it. And what's exciting to me about this is this will be the first hit in what I'm calling perceptual genomics. And this is the question of, everybody's pulling genes for, height or diabetes or aortic stenosis or things like that. But it turns out there are lots of small genetic changes between everybody. And the question is, how do some of those changes cause some of us to experience a different reality than others? That, so far, is completely unexplored, so this will be the first case of that. What I want to tell you about very briefly, just surf over the top of, is some of where we are in exploring the behavioral data about synesthetes with music. And I should mention this is work in progress, so this is ongoing work. But here's what we're finding. Now, I might be able to show you this without crashing my computer. That's the hope. We have this test. Let's see if this works. Is the audio on here? Not so much. Okay, I'm going to unplug this thing and use this instead. Okay, can you guys sort of hear that? Can anyone hear that sound? Okay, great. So what you do is you hear a sound and you pick any color that you want here. You go through, you find exactly the color that best matches your synesthetic percept, and then you submit it, and you get the next one, and you do that. It's exactly the same sort of consistency testing. Okay. So that's how we test for colors of pitches. And I wanted to ask a few questions about that behaviorally. So on this axis, I'm plotting the different pitches. And on this axis, what I'm plotting is the lightness. Is it a really dark color or is it a really bright color? And what I find on average, compiled over many synesthetes, is that as the pitch goes up, the brightness of the color they choose seems to go up too. What's been interesting, though, is that it turns out this is not true for all synesthetes, only some synesthetes. So here's one synesthete who's bang on, as the pitch goes up, the lightness of the color that they choose goes up. But that's not true for all synesthetes. And so if I plot out all the subjects, it turns out that many of them have this positive correlation here, but a few even have negative correlations. So what does this mean? It means that there is, on average, a relationship between the synesthetic color and the lightness, the lightness of the synesthetic color and the pitch itself. There seems in many people's brains to be that relationship wired in there, and yet it doesn't apply to everybody. So what's been educational for us is to get lots of synesthetes together and realize that there's actually quite a bit of variability in the pool of subjects there. Here's another example of that. Some synesthetes have both colored pitches and colored letters, and I wanted to know if the colors, like if your middle C is green, does that mean your letter C will also be green? And so here's examples of two different subjects. What I'm doing here is plotting this out in color space. Don't worry about the details of it. I'm just putting it in color space. And what you can see is for this synesthete, the pitches and the letters of the alphabet have the same colors as each other, whereas for this synesthete, they can be quite different. So on average, most synesthetes, so this is the average distance between the letter and the pitch. So for most synesthetes, they have a very short distance. So most synesthetes are like this, but what I want to point out is there are other synesthetes for whom that's different. That probably has to do with a historical issue of how they learned the notes on the piano, whether they were hearing them first or whether they were learning them by calling them C, D, E, F, and so on. Anyway, we're looking into that more. But the point is that there is some amount of variability here. It's hard to find sort of hard and fast rules for this, although we can find trends. Chord color synesthesia, we can do things like, so here's a chord. Oh, that's not a chord. Hold on. That's the wrong test. That was a musical break. Here's the chord. Okay. So again, people can choose any color they want here, and then submit that color, and they hear the next chord, and so on. Okay, so we here's what we found that was very interesting to us. So this is the average of several subjects, and they're plotted in this color space here. And what we found is that the colors that end up getting chosen have everything to do with the root note rather than the quality of the chord, whether it's a diminished 7 or a major or a minor. It has to do with the root note that determines their synesthetic color. So that's a new discovery, and we're trying to understand that because that was sort of surprising to us. It turns out, again, not everybody does that. Here's an example of a subject who, the C minor, the C major, and the C diminished 7th all have the same color, same with the E's, the F's, the D's, and so on. But here's a synesthete for whom that wasn't exactly the case. And so it turns out that 2 out of the 7 were like this, but 2 out of 9, but the other 7 were like this, where it was the root note that determined the synesthetic color. Okay, and finally, I just want to show you a word about instrument timbre. It turns out that many people, when they hear a particular instrument timbre, that's the thing that triggers the color experience more than the note that's being played in particular. And actually, there are many things that can be associated with instrument timbre. This, again, is that synesthetic subject LS. And, actually, there's 2 different subjects here. And for different instruments, there are different shape experiences that are triggered. So, a thick waving streamer or a lumpy dough-like elongated mass, these are the shapes that get triggered when hearing different sorts of instrument timbres. And this is for LS, the synesthete that I mentioned before. She also has genders and personalities that go along with different instrument timbres. So, the oboe is profoundly emotional and thoughtful, withdrawn, introspective, prone to melancholy. The flute is sweet, innocent, naive, with an artless, childlike simplicity, prone to great frolicking energy. And so for her, there's genders and personalities, which, as I mentioned before with this guy who memorizes the digits of pi, he has digits and personalities associated with things like the numbers. Okay, so to actually study instrument color synesthesia, we do the same sort of tests, and what we have here is the Dallas Symphony Orchestra playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with many different instruments here. So you pick your color. And so on, and we have all of these different instruments here. So we play the instrument, and the person chooses the color that best matches their synesthetic association. This happens to be one subject here out of many that we have. And you can see that subjects can be quite consistent, and this is true, by the way, even if we bring them back a year later and give a surprise retest, they always have the same color experience triggered by the same instrument timbre. So just as a quick thing, one of the things I asked is, does the lightness of the color that's triggered have to do with the high frequency energy in the instrument? So what I mean is something like the triangle or the cymbal or the glockenspiel are high-pitched instruments, whereas the tuba or the bassoon or the clarinet have low pitches in them. And so it turns out that it is the case that there's a correlation here where sort of the more high-frequency energy is in the timbre, the lighter the color ends up getting associated in the brain of the synesthete. Again, just like I showed you before, some subjects have this very strongly, and some subjects don't have that correlation. So what we're talking about is a trend where on this axis I'm showing the correlation coefficient. Most people have this positive correlation, but not everybody. Some people show the opposite. So what we're getting at is there seem to be rules of thumb about how these things get wired up in the synesthetic brains. But they're not rules. They're not unbreakable rules. Okay, so just to summarize this a little bit about musical synesthesia, we find these trends, but also a lot of variability. For pitch color, there seems to be a lot of correlation with the lightness of the color correlating with the pitch as the pitch goes up. With chord colors, we found that they're grouped by the root note rather than by the quality. And in the instrument color synesthesia, we found that the higher pitch the instrument, the lighter the color that gets wired up in the brain in association with that. Okay, now I'm just going to take a 1-second break to tell you about a tribe that was found in South America, and they have two symbols in their language, and one of these symbols they call kiki, and one they call booba. And the question is, which do you think is which? So who thinks that's kiki? Who thinks that's kiki? Okay, who thinks that's booba? Okay. Okay, good. Well, it turns out I lied. There's no South American tribe. But what this illustrates is that everybody thinks that those, this is an old psychological test, actually, and everybody finds the same correlations. Everybody thinks that should be called booba and that kiki, which leads to a very interesting speculation, which is, do we all have synesthesia in some way, in the sense that we have wiring across the brain that's connecting different areas? And when you look at the neuroanatomy, it's now known that there are visual fibers that not only go to visual cortex, but they plug straight into the auditory cortex. And you have auditory fibers that plug into the visual cortex. So you've got all these connections, but for most of us, it's under the surface of conscious awareness. Here's just another example. If I were to take a piano, oh, here's the piano. Good, okay. So if I were to, okay, so which one is brighter? Okay, which one is bigger? Okay, great. So that's funny, right? Because all I'm doing is playing notes, and you guys are talking about brightness and size, right? So what does that mean? It turns out everybody agrees with you. People think the high note is light and small, and the low note is big and darker. What it means is that we've all got these cross-sensory connections in our brains, but we're not aware of them. It turns out there have been studies on this since the 50s, and everybody comes up with the same answer as you do. So it means that that synesthesia might be really an issue about something being above the surface of conscious awareness, but we all have the capability of synesthesia. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about synesthesia, because I want to cover one more area. If anyone's curious about this, here's a book I wrote on synesthesia, and if you have any interest in testing yourself, go to synesthete.org, where you can take any of these tests or pass it on to your friends who might have synesthesia. So what I want to quickly do is tell you a completely separate piece of what we're doing in the lab about time perception, which is sort of the other half of what we do. And so I'll mention a couple things. One thing that one of my students asked me to mention is an experiment that I did in London just a few months ago, looking at whether musicians have better time perception. So I flew out to London. This is an experiment I'm doing in collaboration with the musician Brian Eno, and with his help, we gathered up several famous drummers, including Coldplay and a bunch of famous British drummers, into his studio, and I brought my portable EEG equipment, and we tested their time perception with all sorts of tests that we've devised in the lab. So the question of whether they have better time perception, the answer is obvious, perhaps they do, but the important part is what we're measuring in the brain. So what we're doing right now is running the controls, and we're trying to figure out why they have better time perception. But it turns out they do, and that's not actually the part I'm going to talk about, but I wanted to flag it in case there are questions later. The part I want to tell you about today is this issue about perceived duration. So it turns out that how long you think something lasted in the world may or may not map onto its physical duration. So this is something we've been studying in my lab for several years now, that we can make you think something lasted shorter or longer than it actually did. And this means that the brain is not just passively tracking the river of time, it's actively constructing its perception of time. So I just want to tell you about a very simple way that we study this, and a very wacky hypothesis that this has led us to. So a very simple way that we study this is called the oddball effect. So if I show you a series of objects and then I show you an oddball, it'll look to you like the oddball actually lasted longer on the screen, even though they're physically the same. So I'm going to show you a series of things, and when the oddball comes, I want you to just ask yourself whether it lasted longer or shorter than the standard, the repeated one. Did the clock seem to last longer? Did anybody see that? Oops, let me just try that again. Okay, so there's the shoe. Did anybody feel like the clock sort of sticks on the screen longer? Okay, so we can quantify that every which way from Sunday. The way that we do this typically is we show a series of repeated objects and then a novel object, and we ask, hey, was that longer or shorter than the others in the series? And we do this through hundreds of trials, and we actually manipulate the duration of that to make it physically longer or shorter every time. And by doing that, we can do the psychophysics on it and come up with our answer. And so I'm skipping all the details and just showing you the punchline, which is what we call the duration distortion factor. If it's 1, that means you think that has the same duration. And if it's higher than 1, that means that seems to last longer. So this is just our way of quantifying the effect. It's about a 13% size effect. Now, some people say, oh, well, that's obvious. It's just that you're paying more attention to the oddball. And somehow, perhaps paying attention to something makes it seem to last longer. So I had my doubts about that hypothesis, so we did a few very simple experiments on that. For example, instead of using an oddball that's just some neutral stimulus, we used an oddball that was really scary. So maybe we'll show you, a flower, tarantula crawling on your hand, flower, right? And the question is, does that make it seem even longer? And the answer is no. You don't get any more duration distortion out of it. And what that suggested to us is it's actually not about attention, because people pay a lot more attention when you have a scary oddball like that. And so what we eventually figured out was that this oddball effect really has to do with your violation of prediction. So what happens is when your brain's seeing something repeated, bum, 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 what it's doing is it's making a prediction that is going to keep happening. That it automatically does this unconsciously. Bum, bum, bum. It starts getting used to that. So if you go bum, 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 then it has a surprise. There's a violation of your expectation. Okay. Now, I need to tell you one more piece too, which is that it turns out that the first one in a sequence seems longer than the other one. So if we just show a series of repeated stimuli, and we say, is the first one longer or shorter, and we physically manipulate the duration of that, you get the same sort of effect where it seems to last longer. It turns out if we have random stimuli instead of repeated, then you do not get that effect. It only happens when you have a repetition here. So let me summarize what that looks like in a cartoon, which is if I show a series of objects and then an oddball and a series of objects, the first one seems to last longer than these, and then the oddball seems to last longer. Now, the way people were thinking about this in the literature was, okay, this is like a duration expansion of the first one and the oddball, but what struck me immediately is that it's actually equivalent to think of it as a duration contraction. Right? It could be that you're seeing this for sort of the right amount of time, and then because it's repeated, it contracts in duration. You're seeing that for less time. Okay, so I started looking into that, and I realized that there's a phenomenon in neuroscience called repetition suppression, which seems to map onto this. And I'll explain what that is. Forgive the sort of boring neuroscience graphs, but I just want to point out one aspect. So this is time on this axis, and this is the response of a cell in the brain, a neuron, to a particular kind of stimulus. And what you find is that when you show a new stimulus to the animal, you get a big response out of it. After the animal's seen it a few times, it's familiar, you get a smaller response out of that. So this is what is called repetition suppression. When you repeat something, you get a smaller neural response. You find that here's another animal. This is the first presentation is in black. The second time you show this to the monkey, you get that dashed line. The third time you get that, and so on. So what happens is the more the brain sees something, and again, this is totally unconscious. Monkeys aren't thinking about music or repetition. Right? This is just when you show something to an animal more and more, you get a smaller response. You find the same thing in humans using electroencephalography. Black is the first presentation, red is the second presentation. And in neuroimaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, the first time you show something, you get a big response, and with repeated presentations, it shrinks. Okay, well, if you look at neural response, which is, let's say the number of trials here and the response from a cell, you find that it goes down with repeated presentations. And what I realized is, this has exactly the same character as this sort of contraction that I'm seeing here in the time domain. And so through several years of experiments, what this led me to is a very simple theoretical framework that appears to be right, although it's completely wacky, which is that somehow subjective duration, how long you think something lasted, is a measure of how much energy your brain is using. Now, we don't know why this is true yet, but it's consistent with all of the evidence that we can gather right now. Anything you can do that gives your brain more of a response will seem like it lasts longer, and things that gives less of a response seems to last shorter. Now, we can do that with violations of predictions here, but it turns out when I scoured the literature, you can do it with all sorts of things that give a larger neural response. If you have something that's moving rather than static, it will seem to last longer. If you have something that's more complex than something else, it will seem to last longer. If you have something with more events than something else, it will seem to last longer. And all of these things cause more energy in the brain. If you have something flickering faster, it will seem to last longer than something flickering slower. Something more visible, and even something that's larger, a larger square on the screen will seem to last longer than a smaller square. Or brighter, or in the case of music, louder will seem to last longer than a note that's softer. Okay, and so what this means, when I compiled all the things that can cause a larger neural response, and they all happen to cause the same sort of duration distortion, what that means is that somehow these things are connected with one another. Okay, so why do we perceive duration in the world anyway? This is a very deep sort of question about why we have time perception. I'll just mention that what had been popularly thought was that maybe when you attend to things, when you pay attention, that seems to make it last longer. And what I think is going on might be something like the opposite, which is that you actually have subjective duration so that you can hold on to something longer and pay attention to it. In other words, when something novel happens and you weren't expecting that, it's like your brain gives you more time to chew on it and to think about it and to figure out what that was. Okay, so it's no E equals mc squared, but it's T equals Ka. And the idea is that time, subjective time, is somehow proportional to the amplitude of the neural response. There's a lot more refinement that has to go into this theory in terms of why that's true and if it's certain neural populations are involved or not. But just to summarize what I've told you here is that the perceived durations of repeated stimuli are briefer than those in novel stimuli. And this has to do with neural energy being proportional to subjective duration. And what's of interest to me that I want to learn from you guys during questions or afterwards or just to stimulate discussion is how do musicians use this in their compositions? How do they violate expectations and get duration distortions out of it? Because the things that I showed you were about 13 or 14% distortions, but now in the lab, by doing even simpler stimuli, what we found is that we can get distortions of up to 50%. You can think something lasted 50% longer than it actually did. And for musicians who really care about playing notes with exquisite timing, this has got to be a big effect. And what I want to understand, with your help, is whether that's something that's exploited or avoided. So I'm going to just float that out there. So that's all I'm going to say. If you're interested more on synesthesia, that's my book. I have a new book, Incognito, which has time and the other bits in it. And thanks very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks for those great questions. Let me do it in reverse order. We're just starting to study the relationship between synesthesia and autism right now. It turns out if you look in the literature, there are 0 papers that have the word synesthesia and autism in the same paper. And yet, everybody who works with autistic children notices something going on. So we're just starting a really large-scale study on that right now. I mentioned that we're pulling the genes for synesthesia, and we do neuroimaging on synesthesia. And this is the way that we can know if a nonverbal autistic child has synesthesia, because we can look at all the biomarkers without having to get him to tell us things verbally. So that's the answer to that. As far as whether scratching nails on a chalkboard and that giving you goosebumps counts as synesthesia, we don't typically call that synesthesia only because it's common to the whole population. And even though this is sort of definitions in biology end up being funny a lot, and this is one of them, it's because we reserve the term synesthesia for things that are abnormal, that only a small percentage of the population have. Thanks for that question. Yes?
My question refers to this idea of subjective duration. I'm wondering if you could give a little bit of your insight of time distortion for traumatic events, like time slowing down, like for car accidents, things like that.
It just so happens that's something I've studied in detail, and the way we did it is by dropping people from a 150-foot tall tower in free fall and measuring their time perception on the way down. And what we found is we found that people definitely do have duration distortion, and when they're retrospectively estimating how long something lasted, it seems to have lasted much longer, typically 36% distortion. And yet, surprisingly, what we found is that doesn't actually translate to seeing in slow motion. Instead, it has something to do with the way the memories are laid down. You think that the event took a really long time, but you don't actually get something like, let's say you're in a car accident and the person next to you is screaming. In the movies, if you want to slow things down, then the person says, no, like that. But that doesn't actually happen in real life. And we devised a device that we hooked to people's wrists where we can measure their time perception, and we found they were not like Neo in the Matrix. They were not actually seeing in slow motion, and yet they believed the whole event had taken longer. Thanks for that question. Yes?
Also about time perception, I imagine that you're familiar with the field duration illusion.
Yes.
And I wonder how it connects with what you're doing, so that when you have a time that's subdivided by more events, it feels slower, and that has a consequence in performance, which people actually speed up when a beat is subdivided into more events, so that they will feel solidly that the beat is the same.
Right. This is consistent with the neural energy hypothesis, which is that if there's more things happening, you think that whole event is a longer event. It turns out, by the way, we've just realized there's a visual analog to that, which is that if you have two lines and there's a bunch of lines in between, you think that the length of that is longer than if you just have two lines on the page. It's the same thing in time. Yeah, the short answer is it's exactly consistent with the idea that it causes more neural energy, and therefore you think the whole thing has a longer
And
duration.
just a fun fact is that this idea of louder being longer is something that exists in music theory in writing since the 18th century, where theorists talk about intrinsic length of beats that are accented, like of the dominance, for example.
So do they take advantage of that, or do they try to deal with it?
That's the way they explain the downbeat, even though it has the same length as the other beats, is actually accented because it has intrinsic length.
Great, well thanks. I'd like to hear more about that, either afterwards or from other people. Molly?
So every musician has had the experience of performing and being nervous and playing something, a piece of music that's very fast, and having it feel on stage like you're playing it too slow. And then afterwards, people come up to you, your teacher says, oh my God, why did you play it so fast? I thought I played it slow, and then you listen to the recording and you can't believe how fast it was. It's faster than you've ever played it. Or you're playing in a quartet and you're particularly nervous and you feel like your quartet members are dragging and you're constantly pushing, and afterwards they say, what were you doing? You were playing so fast and you kept pushing it faster. But it only happens, it seems, when you're nervous.
It only happens when your fellow quartet members are not nervous also. So, yeah, this is exactly, time, boy, all of this illustrates the rubbery quality of time, right? And it ain't what you think. We're not just tracking the river of time. It has to do with all kinds of internal states. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a terrific example. And actually, a gentleman here who I'll talk to afterwards, who's a performance musician, said to me, have you ever studied performance musicians when they're really nervous? Have you studied their brains? And I told him that if they're really nervous, they probably don't want me on stage mucking with their brain, but he said he's willing to, so I'm going to follow. Yes?
Another response to that kind of performance nervousness is to play slower. And I wonder how that would be.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. You just play slower. You force yourself to slow down because you are aware of this temporal illusion. Yes?
I'm going to piggyback off of her question about autism. Do you find, I felt like in reading your descriptions of your synesthetes, that they were very, very descriptive of what it felt like, but do you find that they often have a problem verbalizing certain words or things that they feel or see or perceive in their brain, but can't quite get across to you as what they're perceiving?
That's an interesting question. No, I mean, many of the synesthetes I work with are quite verbal. Where they get frustrated is when I ask them to choose colors to go with, let's say, their pitch or their letter. Many of them will say, okay, I can do your stupid test, but in fact, it's much richer than that for me because some colors are sparkly and some have textures like flannel or steel or things like that. Or often it happens with music especially that it's not just colors triggered, but shapes or motion. And so my tests are too crude to capture that. So that's where they get mad at me about it. But as far as being verbally able to describe it, most of them are quite good, which is to say that synesthesia is not autism, although some autistic spectrum disorder children seem to have features of synesthesia. Thanks for that. Yes?
I was curious if that affected the subjective distortion, or is that what you call it?
Yeah, duration distortion.
So I was just thinking when you presented the sequence and you had the novel object here, and if the new stimulus or stimuli was not consciously perceptible, would that effect still occur, do you think?
That's a really good question. We have not tried that. It's a difficult one to pull off because the only way we do these experiments is by asking people, hey, was that longer or shorter than that? And if it's not consciously perceptible, they have a very difficult time answering that. There are cases where you can force people to guess, and sometimes you can tease something out of the subconscious that way. So maybe that's worth experimenting, we can see. But otherwise, we have not done that. Thanks for that interesting question. Yes?
Aside from the example you gave of someone remembering a number by, as they perceive the auto method, what is the relationship that you found with the memory, say like eidetic memory? I've heard that there seems to be some connection, or maybe it's a precursor or a characteristic of someone who might be a synesthete.
Well, I can tell you this. There are people that we call mnemonists who have an untaxable memory. They can remember anything you tell them, long lists of arbitrary words or numbers, things like that. Everyone that we found has synesthesia, and a very rich sort of synesthesia. So the guy who memorized pi is one example. There's this woman named Jill Price who's always on TV because she has this extraordinary autobiographical memory to remember every day of her life. She has a very rich spatial sequence synesthesia where every day has a position, every week, every month, and every year, and they interact in these funny ways so that, June 7th, 2003 has an exact position to it, and she essentially stores stuff in that position. So everybody we've ever met with an extraordinary memory has that because of synesthesia. Thank you for that question. Yes?
Just a little question. I was curious, with the note college
Right, so that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that, because we haven't studied that specifically, but every time I give this talk, I always think, dang it, I really need to study that. So thank you, that's a good reminder for me. Yeah, I don't know. Thank you. Yes?
You said that synesthesia is always advantageous. Has anyone ever tried to induce synesthesia?
Well, there's drug-induced synesthesia. So when people take LSD or DMT, they have the synesthesia, which again indicates that the wiring is already there in everybody's head. It's just a matter of getting the chemical balance correct. We don't yet know if drug-induced synesthesia is the same. I have a very straightforward way to test this, but we can't do that in America. It's too Puritan. I mean, you go over to Europe and do this, but anyway, the straightforward way is you take someone who's not a synesthete, you put them on drugs, you make them do the tests where they associate things, then you take them off the drugs, they can't do it anymore, you put them on the drugs again and show that they have exactly the same relationships, which means that then you're just unmasking something that was under the surface of awareness. So it's easy enough to test if they're the same thing. We haven't done that yet. Thank you for the question. Up in the back there.
Your finding about the chord synesthesia related to the roots of chords. Did you try out tried inversions? I mean, was it the root or the base?
That's a terrific question. Was it the root or the base of that matter? We don't know. So we're on to the next set of studies with that.
Easy to test.
It's easy to test. Every answer that we get in science leads to 2 more questions. So that's one of them.
There's a linguistic phenomenon called word inversion. have particular kinesthetic and perceptual responses to the sounds of words in their language. And so in English, it's well known that a lot of people just really hate the sound of the word moist. You know? And there's a number of them, and sometimes they're very idiosyncratic. But what seems to be happening is there's some kind of connection between the phonological representation of the word and these kinds of sensations. And it seems to be very language specific, so you just don't get the same kinds of words in different languages triggering these things. And so I was wondering if you ever studied that or have some way of looking at word version in terms of synesthesia.
That's a terrific question. I mean, we're well positioned to study things like that, but I didn't know of that effect. It turns out a former girlfriend of mine from many years ago hated the word moist, and I had no idea that was a thing. I thought it was totally idiosyncratic, but there it is. I'm going to text her as soon as this talk's over. Thank you. There had been a hand up back. Yes.
If you do the synesthesia, the color testing, using someone missing the fundamental, do they match up with the same as the actual tone?
Sorry, I missed in the chord color?
No, with the single tones, you take out the fundamental.
Oh, I see your question. Okay, well, that's the other question that's been generated by our, I don't know. We haven't tried that. It's a terrific idea. You know, I tell you, when it comes to music, I'm not nearly as smart as you guys. So anybody who wants to do collaborations on this stuff, that's why I'm here, and that's why this conference exists, to get people like us together. So anyone who has a good idea and wants to try, I'm just across the street. I'm easy to find. So please do let me know what experiments you want to do together. Yes. There are 3 hands in the back, so yeah. Let's go as far as that.
I have 2 questions. The first one, you say it runs in the family. So has the gene been, are there attempts to try to identify the gene associated with it?
So that's what my lab is doing right now. We just published a paper showing that we have the hot spot on chromosome 16 where the gene lives, but there are still 100 genes in that area that it could be, so we don't know which one it is yet. Yeah. Oh, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, the second question is, you associate this with lens, color, and have you ever looked into the correlation between temperature, hot or cold, or the other sensory, like it itches, or it's painful, or it's...
Yes, I zapped it up there briefly, but I had a slide that showed all kinds of different forms of synesthesia, and among them are things like touch color, or pain to color, orgasm to color, all sorts of things like that. So it's not just vision. Thanks for that question. Yes. Yes.
Two comments, maybe more than questions. One touches on the idea, I think you said Suzanne up in the front, I think that's her name, regarding words and our associations with maybe the letters even that form the words. Going back to your example with a kiki and buba, you asked us to, we didn't necessarily have involuntary responses one way or the other or how we would name them, but when you asked us to make a logical assumption, how would we attach these words, these sounds to those images? Everybody seemed to go with the word that had sharper sounds, sharper consonants, and sharper vowels, kiki, to the sharper, pointy object. And likewise, the softer B and U and B and A of the buba got attached to the more blob-like thing. So I was thinking that maybe in the case, these you talked about in your profession, you identify trends like synesthesia in diseased or not diseased, but abnormal cases, whereas we might be, the underlying mechanism might be common, in fact, in what we all do all the time. So it's kind of associative kind of reasoning, so we attach things that make sense when asked to do so, but maybe a delineating point could be synesthetes have no voluntary control over the responses that are triggered in the brain, but we are all, in fact, all of the time, especially when asked to do so consciously, making associations, like when I hear a low pitch on the piano, there is a physical correlation between the kind of wave that's produced that is a bigger, longer waveform than the high-pitched note that you played up on the piano. So I'm wondering if there's just the normal brain does this voluntarily, maybe some subconscious stuff is going on all at the time. but we've got these involuntary lighting up, really strong lighting up of parts of the brain uncontrollably in case where synesthetes, for instance, see tons of color from the ear. Anyway, that was one comment I had. That's too long. Sorry.
I agree.
Okay.
I'm a high school teacher, and my seniors report on your book, on your blue. And somebody, after she finished, said, wait a minute, but Wednesday is blue. And 6 other kids said, yeah. In the classroom of 20 students. And we were wondering if it correlates to Sesame Street.
So actually, I have a good answer to your question, but let me ask you, does Sesame Street give particular colors with
colors
weakness?
with numbers, because when they talked about numbers and colors and letters and colors, and a lot of them have the same.
It's surprising. Okay, so that's a terrific question. When we go through the thousands of synesthetes on the database, what we find is that in general, people have completely different colors. I've got the full statistics on that, and the colors are all over the map. We don't find sort of general patterns except for little whispers of patterns here and there. But I do think that imprinting might have something to do with it. For example, one synesthete who has colored letters, she later discovered when she was cleaning out her parents' attic that her colors matched her childhood refrigerator magnets. So she seems to have imprinted on that. And I was watching my little nephew who was learning to write. He'd take his box of Crayolas, he'd sort of arbitrarily pick a crayon, and then he'd write the letter J 3 million times in that color. And then when it came to write the next letter, he'd sort of randomly pick a different color and write the letter K 7 million times in that. And so he was sort of self-imprinting on these kind of arbitrary colors, but it may well be that that what happens in synesthesia is sort of a sticky plasticity where the first thing you're exposed to sticks.
See, I think it's all like that. I think they all had the same day because they all had planners that were given to them in 4th grade that were in the color for that day. Why do we all think a loud, low note makes a big thing? Because big animals who tread make loud, low vibrating sounds in the ground. I mean, we make these connections so innocuously as we learn and perceive our environment. I think there's all these coincidences that we all are always imprinting, as you say.
Well, that's right. Well, so for normal, okay, so remember, 96% of the population is not synesthetic. And so even though I saw a blue Wednesday and a purple J when I was a child, I continued to see other Wednesdays and J's, and the color got washed out of that because there was no statistical correlation. So 96% of people don't imprint like that. Okay, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But yep, I think it's a terrific point. The other thing you would want to know with your kids, though, is which one of them actually have synesthesia, and which one of them are just telling you that because it's in their planners and it's a memorized association.
Right, and they all took your test.
Great. Oh, well, I'd love to talk. Yeah, it's terrific. I'd like to talk about it. Okay, yellow shirt.
About 30 or 40 years ago, there was a book out that I read. It had to do with psychics in the Soviet Union. And one particular example that was mentioned, and I don't think synesthesia was as well known, or at least it wasn't mentioned in the book, was a woman who was blind. And it talked about how she would reach in to get her spools of knitting thread, and she could feel the color and be able to select that way, because she obviously wasn't seeing color. I'm just wondering, was that synesthesia?
That seems impossible. I'm skeptical. I mean, if you're blind, then you can't. Yeah. Nope. I don't buy it. Nope. No. Yeah. No. Sorry. It doesn't make sense. It would be terrific if you could replicate that and show it was true. But until I have good evidence, I wouldn't believe it. Okay. I can only take one more question. Yes.
I mentioned back in the time perception when you talked about the duration of time seems longer when you're using more brain energy. And I'm thinking about people who listen to music while they're running. And, for me, for example, if I run 3 miles and I forgot my iPod, it seems torturous. But I would think that you're using more energy when you're listening to music because it's 2 tasks. But or is it just more of a enjoyment aspect that decreases that time perception?
That's right. It depends if it's familiar music or not, or if it's music you're really trying to understand and analyze for the first time. Generally, the more familiar things are to our brains, the less energy we use. Your brain is whispering along with that. An example is the first time you drive to your new workplace, it seems like a really long way from your house. And after a while, it seems like you get to work instantly. And it has to do with familiarity. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you guys so much for your attention.